So let's begin. I realize this is the last class of our series. Hopefully we'll continue. Yeah, there'll be.
You have to.
Okay, we will.
Again. I know
We
you
will.
like to encourage people not to do it every year. Shmuel does it every year.
He does, right?
I used to call him Rabbi Haim. So when it came to our community to do the Tshuva series I had taken, he leans over at my lunch table and he says, Ronnie, it's time. Rena calls me Shmuel. It's time for you to start.
Oh, that's great. Great.
Then when I figured out he was a year younger than Rena, it became very.
It worked, right. So there's a topic that I really think is really just important to talk about when we talk about contemporary messages, and it doesn't have to do this time with the tension between the leadership and the the kind of political leadership and the religious leadership, but specifically about the ideas of Jewish life in the diaspora. It just these sources to me are so visceral in terms of like relating to it on a here we go. Relating to it on a very physical and like immediate kind of level. Great. We were just saying.
I started in a quarter after.
No, please.
I'm sorry.
I know the weather has been miserable.
We might have noticed.
Here you go. But we're good. We're just at the beginning.
So that's the topic heading is all she said so far.
Yes. And okay. So we have to start with Sefer Dvarim again, because actually the first time that we talk about Jewish life in the diaspora is in Sefer Dvarim. Because when you think about it, right, like let's think about it, right? Creation of the world, creation of the nation, and then moving towards a nation that's rooting itself in the land of Israel, and the ideal of actualizing Jewish life in Israel. And there's no peace there of, well, what's it like not to live in Israel? So much of like Sefer Dvarim, even the sources that we began with, right, how to like not, against arrogance and power and how not to let the wealth go to your head are all about how does that play out in the land of Israel. But what happens when you are no longer in the land of Israel? And all the kind of like physical, I would say, and also theological questions that are raised. Okay, so this is kind of like, I was like, Moshe like throws it in, like right before, like right a few days before he dies, he's like, well, let's just also prepare for this reality, which is why, again, I think it's such a beautiful piece, because it just speaks to every aspect of our history. It's not just the immediate conquest and settling of the land, it's what's Jewish life going to look like in thousands of years. Okay, so I want to start with these two pieces that frame the story. One in Dvarim Dalid, then in Dvarim Lamed, and then we're going to look at how Yirmiyahu specifically takes this message and crafts it for the people of his generation, and I would venture to say our generation as well. Okay, so here's Moshe's words. Ki tolid banim uvnei banim v'noshamtem ba'aretz v'hishchatem v'asitem pesel tmunat kol v'asitem hara b'nei Hashem Elokecha l'hachliso. Okay, so when, and it's interesting that Moshe frames this not as like if this happens, right? It almost seems like it's inevitable that there will be a time you will have children, your children will have children, you're going to be settled in the land, and you will come to idolatry and doing wrong in the eyes of God. Okay, so there is something a little bit like painful about that fact that it's not because I think the rest of the time he spends a lot of time talking about the prevention of it, but then there are these pieces that say inevitably this is going to occur. Okay, so then, Ha'idoti b'chem hayom et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. It's a very Dvarim-esque theme that the sky and the earth are the witnesses. Ki avod tovedun maher me'al ha'aretz asher atem ovrim et ha'ar yarden shama l'rishta lo tarichun yamim aleha ki hishamei tishamedu. That the land will not tolerate you in it when your actions follow this way. Okay, so what happens next? Ve'hivitz Hashem etchem ba'amim. So God is going to scatter you, and you will end up like kind of little pockets among the other nations where God leads you. Some people here, some people there. The Avadatem Sham Elohim Maaseh Yidei Adam. Eitz ve'eben asher lo yirun, v'lo yishma'un, v'lo yachlun, v'lo yarichun. And while you're there, you will continue to worship idolatry. And I always say we have to transfer idolatry into like what it means to us today. You know, we all right, exactly, right. Physical worship, trying to manipulate the system through physical means, right? That's like paganism, basically. So it's a very tangible and relatable concept. And I think also another thing just to note here is that there's no the fact of exile doesn't naturally lead immediately to return. Right? Like here, he says, you'll be scattered, you'll be kicked out of the land, and you'll continue to, right. Okay, but then there's the turn is in Pasuk Chavtet 29. Ubikashtem misham et Hashem Elokecha umatzata. Okay, but here again, an inevitable promise. You will reach out, you will seek out God there, umatzata, and you will find. God will be found. Ki tidrushenu b'chol levavcha u'b'kol nafshecha.
Such an abrupt change from you worship this God that has none of these attributes, and you will seek God.
Right.
It's a very abrupt.
It's very
change.
abrupt, yeah, and that seems like very deliberate, right? And it's so you will find Him, and again, this mandate though that it has to be at that point sincere. And going back to, right, I think we mentioned that via Hafta, right, those sources in Dvarim. Dvarim has a high demand of b'chol levavcha u'b'kol nafshecha, that everything has to be through your whole soul being there. B'tzar lecha u'matzucha kol dvarim ha'ela ba'acharit hayamim, and when this happens, v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha v'shamata b'kolo. You will return until your God, Hashem your God, and you will listen to His voice. I thought that was a low for me.
Me
It's
too.
a Laban Olive, yeah. Kikel rachum Hashem Elokecha, because God is merciful. Lo yirbecha, lo yashchitecha, He won't destroy you. V'lo yishkach et brit avotecha asher nishba lahem, and He also won't forget the promise, the covenant that He made to the forefathers. Okay. Let's pause for reactions to this source, this first like kind of more expanded source about the. That you will not to heal. So that would be Reish Pei Aleph, and this I think is Reish Pei Hey, which is like weakness, which is interesting because that's the relationship between them is interesting, right? Like when you're weak, you need to be healed. That's that thesis that like whenever there are two letters of a root word that are connected, that there's something, an idea that's connected there. So interesting. I think there's like there's a few pieces like that, that Moshe lays out here for the future. Number one, I am reachable from out of Israel, and I think when you read,
Just call myself.
right, exactly. Maybe it's a cell phone connection, but I am reachable. God is reachable from the diaspora, which is not. It needed to be said. I mean, if you read. It's the Torah is so full of descriptions of Jewish life in Israel that you could conjecture from that. You could walk away thinking that's the only way to relate to God. So first of all, unreachable. The sincerity that's demanded. Also, just note that there's the language of Vishavta ad Hashem Elokecha, that you will return until God. And there's a lot of, I guess they say a lot of ink has been spilled about these words, that it's not like you're there, you're in this process. At first you're continuing, right, to follow, continuing the ways that caused you to leave the land. And then ultimately at one point you're gonna feel something missing, I guess, reach out to God. But even the tshuva that happens is v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, like coming until you reach God. And that seems to be like that kind of first step. And then this narrative ends. It's unclear what happens next, what the next step is. Okay, so that's the beginning of Sefer Dvarim. This is really actually the first, right before the kind of the hardcore section, which is the Aseret HaDibrot and all the mitzvot. This is one of the first things that's said. Okay. Once Moshe finishes in Dvarim, going through all the mitzvot and going through all the commandments and the ways that you should actualize God in Israel, right, then he turns to this theme again. Dvarim 1. V'haya ki yavo alecha kol hadvarim ha'ela, habracha v'hakla. I also, by the way, I didn't put this reading. What we just read is Tisha B'av reading, right? That's what we read on on Tisha B'Av because we're lamenting, kind of, we're observing. I think there's really two pieces here. We're observing the process that has happened, right? This was what Moshe described, and now this is where we are in Galut, in the exile. And I think there's also that hopeful note there that, like, there will be a return. You know, Tisha B'Av is not a fully sad day. It's like the mourning, that's where the mourning kind of transitions to a lot, you know, the hope for the future. Okay, now, Dvarim Lamed. Okay, והיה כי יבואו לך כל הדברים האלה, הברכה והקללה אשר נתתי לפניך, והשיבות אל לבבך בכל הגויים אשר תיך להשם אלוקיך שמה. Okay, so this is following the section of all the blessings and the curses. So after that, right, you're going to v'hashivot el levavecha, you're gonna still be scattered among all the nations, but something's gonna happen, right? Your heart is already being mentioned. V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. So we're kind of going back to the language that we saw earlier in Dvarim. You're going to return to Hashem your God. V'shamata b'kolo k'chol asher anochi mitzavcha hayom ata u'banecha b'chol lebavcha u'b'chol nafshecha. Okay, so a lot of this is really verbatim repetition of what the process is going to look like. Okay, yeah.
That mikol asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, does that not include all the words hatzulim ba'aretz?
Yeah, so it would be without those the laws of right?
No.
Wait, so go ahead, explain.
B'chol asher anochi, is that it should be a bet, right? B'chol asher anochi.
No, kichol.
Oh, then that.
Maybe that.
As all, not by all.
Right. But that's an interesting word.
Yeah.
Because maybe that's what tells you.
Yeah.
That's another hint at the diaspora.
Right. That's fascinating. I always think also a lot of these laws about the mitzvot hatzluyot ba'aretz there's also values that are within them. That even if you're not able to follow those specific laws, what are the overarching, values? Actually, there's a beautiful piece I think by Rav Rimon, who's going to be here next week. Do you know Rav Rimon is the rabbi of Alon Shvu, and he writes the halakha curriculum that we use. And he actually was very involved with resettling people from Gush Katif, and he writes a lot about Shemitah. And there was just an interesting piece that I read it here because we taught it in like the Beit Midrash groups about Tzedek. We were talking about Shemitah, which said even if you're not keeping Shemitah, what are the values underlying Shemitah about making sure that people have what they need and what's underlying it. And you should make an effort that year, the Shemitah year, even if it's not the land per se, how do you keep those values? So maybe that's kechol asher anochi mitzavcha, that you're not keeping the laws themselves, but there's attachment to the values. He's coming to SAR for the day, and he's speaking, it's the 29th, and he's speaking to the teachers. Maybe it's Monday, yeah. Speaking to the teachers and to some of the students. So.
What do you mean some of the students? Can we crash?
I think because he's speaking, it could be because he's speaking in Hebrew, that he's speaking to maybe the Hebrew-speaking classes, or I don't know exactly. What'd you say?
Non-Hebrew speaking.
Yes. Oh, we're being recorded, so we have to. No, but yes, that's not a secret. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Okay. So then, what happens next? V'shav Hashem Elokecha et shvutcha v'richamcha. So God will return your captives. And he will again the mercy. V'shav v'kibatzcha mikol ha'amim asher yifitzcha Hashem elokecha shama. And God will come and gather you from all the lands that you're scattered to. Now here comes from Tefillah L'Shalom HaMedina. Imi yanidacha b'ktzei hashamayim, right? Misham yikabetzcha Hashem elokecha u'misham yikachecha. V'haviyach Hashem elokecha el ha'aretz asher Yoshua botecha v'yirashta v'hitifcha v'hirbecha me'avotecha. Right, so that God is going to reach out and He'll pull you back from the diaspora, wherever you are. Umal Hashem Elokecha et levavcha v'yet levav zarecha. He'll, metaphorically circumcise your heart. Li'ahava et Hashem Elokecha v'chol levavcha u'b'kol nafshecha l'man chayecha. V'natan Hashem Elokecha et kol ha'alot ha'ela al ovecha. Right, the curses are going to go to your enemies. Al sonacha. And then Achet, Atat Tashuv, you will return. V'shamata b'kol Hashem. V'asita et kol. You see that's interesting. The kichol, and now it's et kol mitzvotav. And I think that drash really works. Asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. You'll fulfill the commandments. V'hotircha Hashem Elokecha b'chol ma'aseh yadecha b'pri b'tnecha b'pri b'amtecha b'pri achmatcha l'tova. Right, everything will be increased for the good. Ki yashuv Hashem lasos alecha latov kasher sas al avotecha. And again, the joy. Right, God will again rejoice in you, just as He did for your forefathers. Ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha l'shmor mitzvotav v'chotav v'ktubav v'sefer Torah zeh. Right, when you keep all the mitzvot that are in this Sefer Torah. Ki tashuv el Hashem Elokecha, when you return to Hashem your God, b'chol levavcha u'b'kol nafshecha. Okay, so in some ways the source very much repeats the earlier ideas, and it's kind of a nice framework to, you have all the mitzvot in the middle, this is the, it opens it with like this recognition of human nature and reality, and it closes with it. What's different about this source, or what are you noticing about this piece, the Lamed?
Well, this is not so much Mechutz La'aretz. This is going to gather you. So it's whatever, sort of an indication that we can sit here and wait for him to take us, or we can go and do the mitzvot.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's not purely a discussion of being Mechutz La'aretz.
Right.
Yeah,
it continues the story, so to speak, right? Like the last one, it kind of left it vague, like God will be merciful and there'll be some kind of return. But what will that look like here? There's actually a very descriptive section of what that looks like, what it looks like to be gathered in, even what your physical success will look like when you get back into Israel. Absolutely. Other observations about this source?
This Umbala, it almost sounds like this is almost not really paying in. It's like once I circumcised your heart to me, then that means this is the place where you stay.
Right. I mean, because if God intervenes, then you'll be with Him, and you won't have to worry about in the future what's going to play out. Is that what you're saying? Like the circumcising the heart?
I'm actually saying it's sort of an indication that once you're brought back to the land, it's like a permanent. At some point, it'll be a permanent state that will return to the land.
Because the circumcision is permanent. The metaphor, right? Like the metaphor is a permanent metaphor. Yeah, and it does have that, right? Like it almost has that. It develops it, right? And if let's note for a minute, like the sort of the transitions here. This source is certainly like much more developed, and I would say also like God's role, like you said before, is much more developed here, in the sense of in both ways. Number one, right? How is He going to bring you back spiritually? But it also develops it. How is He going to bring you? How is He going to bring you back physically? But also, how is He going to bring you back spiritually? And what is God's role? Mal Hashem et Levavcha, saying God is becoming almost actively involved in creating a permanence. And I like that idea of the metaphor that you will spiritually be able to stay on track, to stay in the land. But what's interesting, I think, also is that there is still this give and take, right? And notice, the key word here is the word shuv, right, which is return. But who is returning? And that's what changes, right? If you look at the beginning, right, the beginning starts, bet, right, Vishavta ad Hashem Elokecha, you will return to God, right? You take the first step, this return until God, right? Vishamat bekolo, and then Gimel already, Vishav Hashem Elokecha et shvucha, that then God kind of takes over, and He takes over the return. So you have to take the first step spiritually, but then God is the one who says, now I will return to you once you do that. And by the way, this continues, this fluctuation, if you even trace it through, right? So God takes your captives, Vishav v'kabetz mikol ha'amim, He's gathering you, and then Vishav, let's see, and he, it's interesting that the verb is not used here, but He also becomes involved in the tshuva process with the Mal Hashem et Levavcha. But then after that, note in Chet, even after all that happened, right, God circumcised your heart, you've already returned ad Hashem Elokecha, there's another commandment, v'atat tashuv, you will return. We already returned.
The physical return?
So it seems from here that they already have physically returned. Like if we trace the steps, right, they're in the diaspora, there's some kind of like spiritual return. Then God does a physical return for you and helps your spiritual return. And then again, atat tashuv.
So maybe this one doesn't have the exclusionary word ad.
Oh, okay, nice. That it's like a different type of tshuva, which I think is very, just very, like true in life, right? Like there's nothing happens in one instant.
Although in both psukim it says v'shamati b'kolo and v'shamati b'kol Hashem. So the only difference is the word ad. You still, so there's something in that word ad that added to that first pasuk. And it's important to note that it's not the second, but again it says both.
What are they returning to again? They've already returned spiritually. Hashem has returned them to the land. What is the second spiritual return about?
Right.
Have they again turned away, or are they reaffirming their?
Yeah.
What
do you think?
It's not one of those questions that you get on the test and you have no clue.
Right. Right. I mean, in this case, I think I would suggest that the what was it?
In the first pasuk, it doesn't say that I'll do all the mitzvot. It says
V'shamata v'kolo kichol asher.
And we have a question about the word chol, but now it says and I'll do all the mitzvot.
Right.
So there seems to be a more intense degree in this pasuk than there was in pasuk Bet.
Yeah, and so it's very about tatash. Yeah,
One thing I think that when, it's one thing to take the first step spiritually, but I think that when you return physically, that's making a real commitment.
Absolutely. And so then they can only have this later stage of tshuva once they're there and they're committed. That's a good word, commitment, because I always think about that as why is so important, the place so important? Because being in that place shows a commitment to like kind of the whole package and the whole process and the whole relationship. And to go back to the ad and the el, only then, if you look at the last pasuk, Yud, right, what it's Ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha l'shmor mitzvotav v'chukotav ha'ktuba b'sefer HaTorah hazeh, much more descriptive. Ki tashuv el Hashem Elokecha b'chol lebavcha u'b'chol nafshecha. So now it's not ad anymore; it's expanded to el. And it seems like there's a piece here, just from what we've kind of parsed out. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that happened in between, like another negative turn. But that first return was those stirrings. It was the beginning. And then what happens after you make the commitment and you return to the land? Then that can happen. Then it can be the v'shavta el. I wonder. Part of it seems like also tshuva always happens in stages, right? You can't have the second stage until you've done that first stage. Although there is something that suggests here that maybe you need, it's not just that like the second stage could have happened in the diaspora, the second stage needed to happen after you're there and you physically have made that commitment to return. That something's happening there, but it's only the ad, right? And the el could only happen once you get back. Okay.
So where is Hashem taking you back to? I mean, it's kind of clear that He's bringing you.
Yeah.
So you're already there.
And then after that, then you can do the second tashuv, which is the el, which is the end, right? So there's a lot of hope here, right? Like that. But the hope is kind of, I think the hope is kind of more about like there is a future, even though you're going to have this period of real disconnect, right? There's something about having an initial connection, but certainly like the actualization of the relationship is still happening, right? The full relationship is all taking place in the land of Israel and not in the diaspora. There's the connection, but that's it. Okay, now what happens when kind of like this actually practically starts to take place, right? This is all Moshe's giving this, as like, years in the future, this is gonna, what happens when we actually get there? And how do you deal with it at that point? Is this enough? The building blocks are here, but then what? What do you do when this is practical? So this really only first becomes practical at the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE. So this is much, we're talking about really much later. And after having after establishing kings, having the Beit HaMikdash for over 400 years, right? They're used to a certain way of life. And they're also even in denial through the process that this could ever happen, that this could actually play out, right? A lot of Yirmiyahu's Nevuot are about standing in front of the Beit HaMikdash and saying, this is not a forever thing, this is contingent on your actions. And the people saying to him, you're a religious hypocrite, like how could that be? This is part of our fundamental concept that we will always be here. And I almost picture like Yirmiyahu pulling out Dvarim, right? They're very connected and saying, no, like God already told us that we're not always going to be here. But when you're in a reality, it's very hard to visualize that it's possible to be in a different reality.
Is it which king calls the people and reads the Torah, and there's a debate as to whether or not he read the whole Torah to them, or just Devarim?
That was Yoshiyahu, that's what we, right. Yoshiyahu, right. That,
in my head and out of my head in 7 days, sometimes in 7 days.
No, 100%, but that's this, right? So Yirmiyahu, so just give even a little more back. Yirmiyahu lived, right? We know he started out, most of his years were during the time period of Yoshiyahu, a very positive tshuva movement. There was a lot of hope that the people were going to be able to rehabilitate themselves ethically, spiritually. But after the death of Yoshiyahu, and we saw some of the fault lines that maybe the tshuva process wasn't as rampant as Yoshiyahu
They were saying that
thought.
he wasn't living in reality.
Right,
That's not really what was happening.
So, and then it goes down so immediately. So he begins with, here, if we look at I didn't feel it, I should have brought
Timeline of Prophets in the Ring.
Oh, good, okay.
I pulled it up yesterday for my Haftarah class.
Oh, nice. I'm opening up, I should have brought a Tanakh with me. Here we go.
MikeTaylor.org.uk, but I Googled timeline prophets and the reigns of the kings of Judah. It came up Judah and Israel.
So the first, that's great. So the first pasuk, right, tells us who he lived. He lived in the time Divrei Yirmiyahu ben Chilkiyahu. I'm just quoting from the beginning of Yirmiyahu. It's not on the source sheet. Min hakonim asher ba'anatot be'eretz Binyamin asher haya davar Hashem elav b'mei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda b'shos esrei shana l'malko. During the time of Yoshiyahu, that was the first king, and then it continued by Bimei Yehoyakim ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda ad tom shtei esrei shana l'Tzidkiyahu ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda ad galut Yerushalayim b'chodesh hachamishi. So he ruled during the time of first Yoshiyahu, then Yehoyakim, then briefly Yehoiachin. We'll see he only ruled for 3 months, and then Tzidkiyahu. Tzidkiyahu and Yehoyakim both ruled only 11 years. So. But that's, I shouldn't say only, 11 years, right? I guess compared to Menashe, right, 55.
Someone just did 3 months, after
Right.
11.
It tells you who was prophesying on the Israel side and who on the Judah side, and the only line that's missing for me is next to the kings. I wanted to put a little code, bad or good.
Right.
Because that would really help me. Every time I
Right,
have
totally.
To remember.
Yeah, so this is actually, so we remember how like Chizkiyahu, good. Menashe, bad.
Yeah.
Yoshiyahu, good. Yehoyakim, bad, right? That was, he took over and kind of just undid all the positive things that Yoshiyahu did. Yehoiachin, 3 months, we'll talk about him in a minute. And then Tzidkiyahu, last Judean king, wishy-washy. Sort of good intentions, couldn't follow through, ended up, I guess, bad, but you feel like there was potential there that he didn't play out because he was so weak and so dependent on the people for approval that he couldn't stand up there as a strong leader. Yeah, I really recommend Rav Benny Lau's book, that Blue and White book. It's great. It just tells it to you in a story and weaves the prophecies in. It's really just a beautiful, masterful book. Okay, so let's look at what Yirmiyahu said, because I think we have to just keep that in mind that it's practical now, right? The people now, when does it actually become practical? So if you flip, this is the next source, Yirmiyahu Chavted. It's actually one of my favorite parakim in Yirmiyahu because it's just so, it's gorgeous. Okay, so here's what he says. Eila divrei hasefer asher shalach Yirmiyahu hanavi miYerushalayim el yeter ziknei hagola el hakohanim ve'el hanebiyim ve'el kol ha'am asher higla Nebuchadnezzar miYerushalayim Babel. Okay, so this is the words of the letter that Yirmiyahu sent from Jerusalem to the first group of people who were exiled by the Babylonian king, by Nebuchadnezzar, from Yerushalayim to Babylonia. Now, what this meant was there were a few waves of galut, and two major ones. The first one happened 11 years before 586. When we think about like this total destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and everything that happened then, that's later, 11 years before. Really, here, if you look at the next pasuk, Acharet Seit Yechoniah HaMelech, right, the king Yehoiachin. That's why he only ruled for 3 months, because he was exiled. Bahagvira, right, and his mother, she must have had an important role in his life. Bahasarisim, Sarei Yuda Yerushalayim, Bahacherish, Bahamasker Yerushalayim. So kind of the way we look at it is like all the upperclassmen, all the like wealthier people, also here it says the craftsmen and the smiths, maybe because they wanted to take away, Babylonia wanted people to know weaponry, so they wouldn't be able to fight back. They could really be kind of a vassal state that couldn't respond at all.
Use them to build up their own military.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. And by the way, we do see that in books like Daniel, right, where it's a Babylonian exile, and we see that that's where people were helping. Daniel worked in the king's court. They took these young, talented boys to work.
During Hitler.
Right, exactly. So there's like a dual purpose, right? Like they want to get the most out of these people, and they want to weaken the vassal state enough that they're not going to rebel. Okay, so this is really 11 years before the destruction of the temple. Now, by the way, just to relate to what we spoke about last time, remember we talked about how the southern kingdom saw the exile of the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom and like didn't learn the lesson. So then this is happening again. Like the people in Jerusalem see what's happening in the first wave of exile, like all the people and the infrastructure being debilitated, and they don't take the lesson. Now, why is Yirmiyahu writing a letter? So there's a he's writing a letter because the people, right, they don't know what to do. Like all of a sudden, they're in the diaspora and like, what? I don't know how to live life in the diaspora. So he has to essentially give them instructions. And you kind of we have a little bit of life in the diaspora, a little bit from Yechezkel. Yechezkel was part of this wave, by the way. He went out and then he prophesied to the people that left with this galut. But we learned from here like kind of what was happening. Okay, so here's Yirmiyahu's instructions to them. Banu batim vashedu. Okay, build houses and live there. Natu ganot ve'ichlu et peryan. Right, plant gardens and eat the fruit of your gardens. Kichu nashim ve'holidu banim banot. Right, take wives and have children, sons, daughters. Ukichu l'bnechem nashim ve'et benotechem tenu la'anashim. And you know what? Not only should you have children, you should marry off your children, right? V'taletna banim u'banot v'ravu sham v'al timatu. And you should have children there, and you should become rav there. You should expand. V'al timatu, and don't
Don't lessen your numbers.
Yeah, I always think about that even in times of like kind of strife and exile and oppression over history, right? What always happens? It's the biggest birth control, right? Because people say, I don't want to put roots down here.
But you look at Israel and Mitzrayim, and that's the prototype for what you do in the face of that.
Right.
The women, you look in the mirror to make themselves beautiful for their husbands.
Right, and I always think that that's like the first, almost like the first case of like civil disobedience, where the people weren't fighting back physically against the Egyptian
But they were
group,
fighting back
but they
physically.
fought back like, they fought back like metaphysically building up the nation. They still had faith in the future. It was having children, right, and also planning for your children's children, right. Building a house,
Well,
a garden doesn't grow right away.
That's also
It's
spitting
for the
in the
future.
spitting in the eye of your oppressor. It's like, you're not going to destroy
Right.
this nation. We are, even if we're in Galut, you're still going to have to deal with the numbers that we are going to be.
And the underlying message also could be, don't look back to Mitzrayim when the argument for putting us down was that we had grown big in numbers and strong.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to grow big in numbers.
Right.
So it's also a little bit of a ring that harks back to the history that they've been.
Yes, yes, it absolutely goes back to Mitzrayim. And I would even go, I would even note, like, this is super positive. Like, it's,
Yeah, but read the next sentence.
okay, then, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Read the next sentence.
Vidar
It doesn't say
Shulish-
that. It
okay,
doesn't
vid-
say that. It
Doesn't
Just
say the
multiply, but
positivity.
it says, no, to me it says be subservient, because as long as the city where you're in Galut, is quiet, you're okay.
Yes, absolutely.
It doesn't say rise up or try to do it. This is like,
This is keep
Pray
us
that
of
it's-
course on our obligations, our civil obligations.
Yes, absolutely. And that's right, which is a fascinating question. Why do we commit to our civic obligations? Is it because we fundamentally see value in them, or is it because we're kind of trying to like just keep a low profile,
yeah, if you don't see
start
me,
up?
you're not gonna understand.
Right. So that's it, right. V'darshu et shlom ha'ir, v'palu ba'ada, right? That's tefillah ba'ad artzot habrit, right? Davening for the, right? Ki b'shloma yeh lachem shalom. You're right. It sounds like the ladder, right? Like it's
Right.
just,
As long as it's quiet there,
Right.
it's safe, because the truth is, every time, and we see it in our own history, every time there's strife, the Jews caused it.
right.
It's the Jews' fault.
It's
So as long as things are quiet, it's
Lay
not
low.
laying, it's not a matter of laying low. It's more like, as long as the people of where you are happy,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to be a target. You will be.
Uh-huh.
I want to take that and do this with it.
Okay.
Of course.
Because we're doing this for 63.
Yeah.
That's how long. And so if you flip it the other way, it's also if we are at peace with our values,
Yeah.
we're going to be bringing those values of peace to the people. It's not that it protects us from them, it improves the society that we all are part of. So you can look at this pasuk in both ways, which is why we have endless conversations about it.
Right. That's interesting. What do you think about that?
I don't see
You
that
don't
anywhere
see
in
it?
the sentence,
Right.
because it doesn't say anywhere at all that we're influencing them.
Right.
It just says, it's palalu ba'ada.
It doesn't say do anything.
It doesn't say you're doing anything.
That's
Just,
fair.
you know, v'palalu ba'ada el Hashem, ki b'shloma yeh lachem shalom.
Right.
To me,
So
it's
it's
more
more
as
of like
long as they're gonna be happy-
self-protection.
Right, as long,
Right.
once there's strife, no one wants to look in the mirror and say, I caused it. They always look to see who else can I blame for it.
Right.
And simply because I don't think the world understands
Right.
our religion and how we have perpetuated and stayed all this time,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we're to blame.
Right. It's
And it's rare
mhm.
that we fight back.
Right.
So it's a perfect target.
It's interesting also though the richness. The question is then how do you read the richness of the descriptions of how rooted you are in that society? Note even there's a lot of Bereshit language, like Gan Eden language.
Right.
In it, right? Like it's Banu batim b'shev, natu ganot, right? Plant gardens. Ichlu et piryan, pri. You're eating the fruits of the garden. Kichu nashim v'holidu banim ubanot, right? The pru'urvu, the commandment of continuity. There's something here that feels very like sort of building and positive, and that's what I struggle with reading. On the one hand, are you reading it, is it a preservation so that you will ultimately be able to get back and you won't die out in the meantime? Or is it also that there is a flourishing that can and should happen in the diaspora? And are we like biding our time?
That's a great, well then this becomes a perfect excuse for all of us in here.
Okay, so this
Great
becomes,
excuse.
but how so? Like it's,
Because he's telling us where you are. He's not saying prepare yourself for the return. He's pretty much saying take roots.
right. I remember I had a student, this is years ago, in,
So many years ago, we're sure.
well, it was in camp, and she was a French girl, and she was post her year in Israel. It was, and I remember we were learning, and so like she was very focused on making Aliyah. It was also, especially around the time where there was a lot of there still is, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism. People were reading the writing on the wall and thinking about, and she said, "This is the only section of Tanakh that we have ever kept." Like, I remember her standing there, like, so adamant. She's like, "We only did this, Banu Batim Vashevu. That we are check. We did that."
Because I wanted to come back at Rachel, I actually went and pulled up all of 29. You skipped
I did skip a little
but
bit,
you
yeah.
skipped them deliberately. All it is telling you that don't listen to those false prophets.
Right, it wasn't right.
Because I didn't send them.
Right.
All right, so Rachel still got.
Okay, but right, but here, I think actually you're going to get the points for the next section also, because if you look at the next section, well, I'm not sure. Okay, let's see. Ki kol marshem, ki lefi malot lebabel shavim shana, et odet. God says this is not a forever situation. In
He didn't give
70
me a
years.
time period.
Yeah, it's very specific,
specific.
which is bizarre. Right, that's the 70 years. They're
And
writing
yet
on the
people
wall.
refused to go in 70 years because Shiva
Right.
Sion was a very small portion, and we know what was going on in Babylonia because we've got a whole Talmud to prove.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and we know that's the books of Ezra, Nehemiah,
Right.
Haggai.
Yeah.
Haggai is telling the people, he's the prophet at the time of after the 70 years, and he's saying, go back. Cyrus said you could go back. Darius said you could build the Beit HaMikdash, and nobody wants to go. People say, well, I built my house, and I have my children live here, and what if they don't come? And,
It's interesting, he makes them too late for this. No, actually 520.
right. No, it's
586, 520.
right. And also there's ways where exactly do you pinpoint,
No, of course.
Okay, so then he says, okay, so right, I'll remember them. But just note also having children, grandchildren, now we're talking about 70 years. It's very strategic. Have children, have your children, have children, and then 70 years going back. We're going to return back to Israel. Now this is still talking about your religious access and mandate in the diaspora, right? You're going to ubikashtem oti umatzatem ki tidrushuni b'chol lebavchem. Okay, we saw these words. So right now, what he's doing is he's playing off of the Dvarim source. All this was his, right? The sitting in the diaspora and developing. Moshe didn't talk about that at all. We were kind of a little fuzzy about what actually happened there other than idolatry. But right, so that part is all built up by Yirmiyahu, which makes so much sense, right? Because they needed direction. I really picture a frozen people, they're all immigrants, and they weren't building houses, and they weren't physically flourishing, and they also weren't calling out to God because they had this idea in their heads that, right, God abandoned us, right? We were rejected. Now the covenant, right? And that's certainly a claim that's been made, right, that we've been abandoned, and even if you don't say we've been abandoned, you can't access God from the diaspora. Where's God in Babylonia?
Right.
So then he has to say, "Umatzatem ki tidrshuni b'chol lebavchem v'nimtzeti lachem." Again, this matzah is now becoming our recurring word. I will be found to you. And now we go back to our shav words, the return. V'shavti et shvutchem, v'kibati etchem mikol hagoyim, mikol hamikomot, asher dachti etchem sham, ne'um Hashem, v'hashivoti etchem el hamakom, asher higliti etchem sham. You will be returned.
The dictum, the nimseti,
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, what do you make of that?
It's a passive verb.
Yeah.
You're doing the
God
finding.
says, I'm doing it, you're not doing it.
Yeah. And that kind of puts the onus a little bit on you, right? V'karati oti, v'halachtem, v'hitpalaltem alai. By the way, the v'halachtem is interesting, where are they going? You'll call to me and you will go. I think the Midrashim there say, where are you going? To the Beit Knesset. Where do you go? You need to still build for yourself. You don't have the Beit HaMikdash anymore, but you're still going to build for yourself a place that you can turn to God in a very different kind of way.
Where are they building that Beit Knesset?
In Babylonia, right? And now, but there was a movement. Yechezkel alludes to a movement. There was actually a movement that went to the other extreme. This, I think, sounds like people are kind of paralyzed. Yechezkel talks about, I think, a group of people who tried to actually build a Beit HaMikdash in Babylonia. And he says, no, that's also wrong. There's a little bit of this limbo piece, flourish, but not too much, because then in 70 years, you're going back.
Then we go back to her attention, flourish but not too much, because you're on pins and needles with respect to the nation you're living in.
Right, exactly, yeah. And then, right, here this is all about you, right? And I think that you seek me out, I think you're absolutely right. I will be found for you. You have to be the seeker, but then in the end, right, all the active words, God becomes totally active. V'kibatzti, right? V'hashivoti etchem. Hashem is the one who is doing all the actions once we've done the reaching out.
In other words, he's also taking responsibility.
Yes, absolutely. Right, and that's what we've seen also, in just the Tanakh assumption is always that everything that happened is part of God's plan, and usually as a response to our behavior.
I always laugh. people always said to me, God has a plan.
Right,
And my response was always, can you give me a hint?
right,
And here's giving a lot of hints.
right, right.
But the hints stopped within the minute.
That's what happened. It's a different mode of functioning. I mean, like the Tanakh
Because anyone who
mode.
tries to be any years later, anyone who quote said they were Navi, they were false prophets.
Right, right,
So more in the 17th, 16th, 15th century,
right,
Naviut was not allowed.
right. But then when you look at the prophets, I think one of the responses this has been, if you actually look what the prophets say, mostly what they're saying is follow the Torah. So at a certain point, in a way, maybe we didn't need to have these prophets coming anymore. We had such a developed idea of what the Torah is that it puts the onus more on us. What's ki tidrashuni b'fol about them? That means you do it yourself. You don't need a prophet coming to tell you do this because we became too passive. You need to seek out, well, what is the way of God, on our own, without that kind of, that's a way. And I think this spins it a little bit. The way that I just framed it is kind of saying that there's an ideal piece of not having prophecy anymore, in that we have to do it more on our own. And that's what happened after in this time period when we were transitioning away from prophecy. And this leads to the exact tension, I think, that with those, especially those middle sources there. Is there any sense of an ideal of living in the diaspora? Right? And this, I think, we have to, here we are, we're here. How do we look at our lives here? Do we look at our lives here as kind of like a b'diavad, we ended up here, so we're doing what we can do, and we're going to try to get by, or do we look at our lives here as there's something that we can accomplish here that's unique or that's different that we wouldn't be able to accomplish if we were living in Israel?
Or Israel. That we do here for the benefit.
Well, okay, so then that's,
Well, that's the
another
answer to the
question.
That's part of what is it that we are developing and we're doing here.
Right.
And it may very well be in this time range.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that leads also
That's
to,
different.
but there's a different, I think that is an important bifurcation there. Let's say we say that there is an ideal to living here. Is the ideal to living here because, Israel needs advocates, right? And that's definitely been a strong, political sentiment.
There's a piece
Or,
of
right, is there a piece of Orlok, which I think is totally different. That's not saying we need to be here because then America will influence and give money and, things like that. But we're here because there's something to gain, either for us, right, as Jews,
or our charge.
and or our charge to be Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, right, the Kohanim in terms of being the teachers. This is a real tension that I think is captured here and not at all resolved. I wanted to I'll show you just to expand on that piece a little bit. There was a fascinating article. I read this it was 2015. I feel like it was earlier. When was it was in this is so light. I think I'm just not even going to be able to read it from the source. I have it open on the computer. Eli Jesner, I think he's British. He published an article he lives in England. I don't know if he published an article, it was in Haaretz. He also published it, I think, in Times of Israel, but he wrote, Netanyahu, stop telling me where my home is. And it was here, I'll just read you the beginning of it. I do wish Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would stop telling me where my home is. In the aftermath of the Paris tragedy, that's when it was, it felt a little bit distasteful and opportunistic, but one was willing to be somewhat forgiving. And then he goes on to say, after the Copenhagen shootings, what I find particularly bothersome is how Netanyahu presumes to know what being Jewish means to me. And he says, as a diaspora Jew, I have been forced to do battle with a complex and fragmented sense of identity and to try to understand what roles, positive and negative, Judaism might play in that mix, and it is an ongoing struggle, particularly at moments like this. Right? While a certain approach to Jewish education in the diaspora may have contributed to a sense that we were all simply failed Israelis, armchair Zionists who chickened out of Aliyah, many of us have come to realize that that simply isn't the case. At some point this summer, driving on a motorway outside Tel Aviv, the thought crystallized in my mind, I am not an Israeli. I may love the country and its people. I may stand in awe at some of its achievements. I am fond of the time that I spent. I have family and close friends. But as a diaspora Jew, I'm part of a tradition going back 2,600 years to the first Babylonian exile. Judaism, and I think this is a fascinating sentence, Judaism at that moment ceased to be a national concern and became instead a universal and transportable system of values, a dynamic and evolving way of living. So this, what you could...
Part of it smacks of an excuse for the beginnings of reform and conservatism and Reconstruction, but... Well,
in the sense of it's all values and it's not rooted in physical...
Think that's what he's saying, and
he's actually an observant, I think he's observant, Elie Jesner.
Spell Jesner?
Jesner. And he actually quotes like Aaron Kohler's book. Do you know Aaron Kohler? He's a professor in YU, but he wrote a book about Megillat Esther where he argues that Esther was written as kind of like a counter ideology to books like Ezra or Daniel, right? Which were very much like stay insular and like do what you need to do, like even like with the famous stories of like Daniel and his friends, like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they refused to eat like non-kosher food in the king's palace, and how do you stay strong by being very insular? And that Esther, his idea is that the book of Esther is about a different way of being in the diaspora where you're much more like involved with the culture surrounding you. So I think
it's the same tug of war between our two perspectives.
Exactly, right? That exact tug of war. So there's two, right? One is like, how do you live life in the diaspora? What should your life look like? How open should you be? How insular should you be? And then I think another question is, how do you view your life in the diaspora, right? How do you view your political involvement? For what purpose is it? How much should you be? Is there an ideal peace? Or is it that this is, we don't always have control of our history and where we are, and this is how we're doing it. Let's take a look. I'll show you the Rabbi Sachs has this last piece. He wrote in a beautiful book, A Letter in the Scroll, where he talks a little bit. He talks about what happened after the destruction of the Second Temple, and I do think he takes a little bit of this perspective that there's an idealism to it. He says here, but within the inner journey of Judaism itself, something decisive took place within the destruction of the Second Temple. Politically, a disaster. Spiritually, it unleashed a set of developments always implicit within the covenant of Sinai, but never fully achieved so long as Israel was in the arena of power. The irony is that it took the loss of Israel's national independence to bring a flowering of the religious vision. Now that the temple lay in ruins, every Jew became a holy person, right? Not just the priests, the Kohanim, offering prayer instead of sacrifice and achieving atonement through repentance, as opposed to, again, bringing that physical korban. At last, the ideal of Sinai became a reality. Israel was really a kingdom of priests. The synagogue replaced the temple. Repentance substituted for the rights of the high priest. Judaism, no longer a religion of land and state, became a religion of faith, built around homes, schools, and communities, and this would sustain them as a nation. Very, very. Now, what's interesting with Rabbi Sachs, and I think this is the difference between like Rabbi Sachs and the way he writes and like, let's say, a blog like Elie Jesner's blog. Rabbi Sachs, he kind of stays in the realm of like philosophy and theory, and some of these very practical blogs are saying, well, this is how I want to like translate this into my own life and the choices that I make. And then I think it raises the questions kind of for us, like, where is that idealistic piece? And on the one hand, I think it's important, no matter what, right, whether it's true or not, it's important to find it, because we can't live our lives as like, I'm just here and accomplishing a minimal amount. It's important to have that, like we need that in our life. But I wonder also if there's something there, even back in the words of Yirmiyahu, that this flourishing and this new building has this sense of an idealism there. Yet. So So no answers to resolve here. But I think it's a tension that it's very moving to me, because I think it's a tension that living here, we live with. And I think it's a tension that I would say my friends living in Israel don't totally understand. Like this tension of get the beauty here, the banu batim vashivu, the two, and what can be accomplished.
We've learned sometimes to sit quietly at dinner tables with the only Litzlaris people that are shop there. Sometimes I grab my husband's leg and let's just listen, let's not engage.
Right, right. And yet, right, when I go to Israel and I see the flourishing that's there, it's missing here.
Especially well, I think learning is flourishing here too, but it's mind-boggling
what's happening there. Yeah, and there is, I do feel like when I'm there, there's something missing in my life, and yet,
and I have that every time we go. I have that highway experience you quoted from Ari Jesner.
Mm-hmm.
I have that feeling that I just don't quite feel that this is my place. Can I live here is the question I always ask. And what? Yeah.
No, I think the only way people know if they can live there is living there. There's
Right.
I lived there for a number of years, came back for family reasons.
Right.
And every time I go back, I don't regret it because I've seen my great nieces and nephews, and
Right.
I know that. But I really feel, and I see my friends, that there's something I envy her having stayed there, and I didn't. And it's not envy because, I wish I could. I know I can,
Right.
but I know there's a certain fulfillment
Mm-hmm.
that's there.
Yes.
And every time I'm there, I feel it missing.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference. There's no way, everyone says, I don't know if I could. Only to do this to try.
Right.
And there are everyone has really viable and honest reasons is why they don't take that step. And none of it is wrong.
Right.
They're all right for the individuals. And I have friends who sit there and try to put guilt on me.
Right.
My answer to them is, you did what you did. Let's see if you can survive in the diaspora for a while.
Right.
I'm not sure you can, and that's not a positive or negative. It's just
Right.
everyone's individual.
Right. Right. Right.
And the difference is some of your friends were people who were born there and lived there.
I have some friends, I have a number of friends.
Because my friends who are older don't quite put that on us. And it's different because they get the other side of the coin.
Right, right.
Although Joe is heavy in making us
Right.
do things like,
Well,
I
Joe
took
is doing
Maser. It was great. I took Maser, I guess, Shane
Yeah.
with a bracha. It's something I'd never get a chance to do, but
Wow.
Carol and I did it together.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in little hidden pieces like Yirmiyahu, Esther, there's this tension is kind of preserved and forces us to kind of ask the question, how are we living our lives here in the diaspora? How do we find meaning and how do we contextualize it? No easy answers. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
If
you
this
so
went on
much.
forever, none of us would complain even
Oh.
a little bit, and if it was snowing today, I still would have.
Oh, that's so sweet. This is
That's
wonderful.
really-
This
it
was,
was-
I really was so,
This was a class that was absolutely enjoyable. And I have had, ever since high school, not like necessarily sitting and learning in classes.
But
And
we went to lunch afterwards last week, we were talking about the fact that we first learned Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu, I think together in 8th grade, whatever. And then we went on and learned it in different places. And we're still sitting and talking about it this many years later and still peeling the onion.
well, I think that's the beauty of Torah in general, that there's at every stage, it means something different. Like there's always something.
Well, I'm looking at stuff now, and I think as an 8th grader, and we had a teacher who sat there and said, you have to learn every midrash. And my joke was, as much as you gave 20 midrashim, there was always a girl thinking, more I know than 20
Right.
girls. But I think it was done through different eyes, and we're seeing it now, and I think it's almost criminal, I think, in many ways, to teach some of these things before you have a certain life experience, because you just learn it rote. You learn it
As
rote.
an educator, though, I really believe that I was a speech therapist in my first professional life, and sometimes I would say things that I knew were above the ability level,
Right.
even the processing level of a kid. But my philosophy was, this is a brief commercial from your local language
Right.
person, because that way when you're ready to understand it and use it, it won't be alien to you. You will have
Right.
heard it before. Like we skipped over the story of Dina. Of course you should skip over the story of Dina until
Right.
you're ready to
Well, we
learn the
started
story
with
of Dina. What?
We started with Lech Lecha.
So we
never learned Rashis and Noah.
Right.
In elementary
No,
school.
didn't we go back to it in grade art? I did it as a freshman in high school.
Yeah.
Right, but that really, yeah, it's true. I think at every stage it means something different.
But also at every stage of a teacher, where you are in life. 'Cause I remember as a teacher, after having children, I taught differently and I looked at the students in a very,
I'm
very
laughing because I
different
used to
way.
say if the kids were particularly rambunctious, and I said, I don't have to sit here and be ignored by you, I can go home and be ignored by
Right.
the experts. That was one of my canned lines for
Right.
middle school kids.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. Anyway, this was
Wonderful.
wonderful.
Thank you, very
And-
wonderful, we so appreciate
Great.
it. Yeah.
It was great. I feel like I learned so. I looked forward to it every week. And I came back, actually was in Florida for a few days
Good.
because my kids were off this week. So my in-laws are there. I left a few of them there. But my flight, I
Beautiful.
came back last night, and my flight kept getting delayed. And I kept thinking, no, but I have to get back for the class. So
So you and your
Michelle.
husband wasn't going to be there to give the Gemara final for the freshmen?
No, he wasn't, he left.
Okay, only because my
She was so
grandson,
dummy, she knew what to
my
say.
grandson was refusing to study last night. He's struggling with it. He's like loving everything else.
Mine is being taped.
What?
This is being taped.
Oh, we didn't turn us off yet, never mind.
Never mind.
Yeah,
Nothing, I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
It's important.
Tell him he's
to
gotta
remember-
edit the last.
right, the
It's
last, I think
important-
he can, yeah. I mean,
It's
there's lots of
important to
people, so-
remember that all of life is being taped.
Right,
You should always
so true,
remember
it's a
that.
good, it's a good
Did you see
metaphor.
something on Facebook that they said that you have to do something now because after Thursday or some day in January, everything, your picture and everything will be out to the open and it can be used.
You always had to go in there and, if you didn't
Privacy
put your
settings.
settings, that it's only personal, only friends.
But it's beyond that, I think.
No, I think it's more, I've
So
seen.
I have been assigned a
Okay.
task.
Yeah.
I think, was it the OU that did a grant to schools
Mhm.
for women's projects?
Yeah,
So our school got a project, Women Teaching Women. So the concept was we would learn how to do a well-developed Dvar Torah.
oh,
And for the
beautiful.
spring, so I took the first 3 classes, and I'm convinced that what I want to do now is models for being a diaspora Jew. I'm convinced that that's the
Oh.
I'm going to pursue over the next 3 months, so can I email you?
Of course, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Amazing. You know who has also, Rabbi Harkstark has a video,
Okay.
a Siach video, that you should take a look at, because there was a group that studied this for Machon Siach.
It seems to me that somebody did a piece of Machon Siach with us, because it wasn't rich enough. I don't want to say who people did it. Machon Siach on.
But I think he has a video about this tension.
No, wait a second. HAR.
CZT? Aaron?
Oh,
Oh, no.
I just
Oh,
typed it. Yeah, that's
What's his
right.
name? Your friend in tech just told us.
He
what-
told me, but I
He
don't
told us
remember.
they have a mnemonic for how to remember how to spell
Oh,
somebody's
really?
last name.
Oh, I didn't even know. That's so funny. But he has an interesting video about it.
There's a C in there.
HAR.
Put it anywhere.
It's her stock, it's
Right.
CCT.
Once you start typing it, it comes up.
My daughter was a.
That's exactly what it's doing.
My daughter's a student here.
Who's your daughter?
Shira Silver.
Oh, what grade is she?
She actually graduated in 2016.
Oh, she was, okay.
She graduated in
Uh-huh.
2016, but she loves Gemara. I mean, she started with very little background because she started selling gender and changed to SAR, and all of a sudden her life changed. She,
Wow.
as I said, she spent a year at Ishmael,
Wow,
studied
beautiful.
Gemara. She loves it. She absolutely she loves it. She was teaching. She was tutoring other children.
And I feel that we were deprived, because as girls, either we didn't have it at all, or we had it to a very limited extent.
Yes.
And Moshe wasn't here today, Edelman, but he would make a comment every now